Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight, we're stepping back into a world where the mind was a mystery and fear was medicine. It's the Middle Ages, an age of faith and famine, saints and superstition. When a person began to see or hear what others could not, the world called it madness, and the cure was whatever kept everyone else from being afraid. Before we start, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair plus other sleep tools in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. In the Middle Ages, there was no language for the mind as we understand it now. The boundaries between thought, emotion, and faith were seamless, bound together by the certainty that every moment of existence carried divine intention. To live was to interpret. Drought, plague, childbirth, and joy each revealed something about the will of God. A man's health reflected his virtue. A woman's pain was a trial of her soul. The physical and the spiritual were never separate. Illness might blister the flesh, but its cause lay elsewhere, in sin, in weakness, or in the testing hand of heaven. Knowledge moved in circles rather than lines. Scholars and preachers described the world as a mirror of divine order, and whatever could not be explained by nature was explained by grace or by its absence. The stars turned because angels guided them. Storms came when the heavens expressed displeasure. Madness, what we might call the mind's breaking, was the most mysterious of all. When words lost their order or thoughts became unmoored, it was not seen as chemical or accidental. It was a spiritual event, a sign that the invisible world had drawn too near. The medieval body was a vessel of meaning. Every humoral imbalance, every fever or dream hinted at moral decay or spiritual intrusion. The soul sat at the centre of this fragile design, suspended between sin and salvation. When someone raved or withdrew into silence, it was not a symptom, it was a message. The question was never, what is wrong with them, but who speaks through them? Some believed the devil whispered in the ear. Others thought God tested the faithful through visions too heavy for ordinary minds. This faith-bound worldview left little space for uncertainty. The cosmos itself was moral, arranged in a hierarchy from angels to worms. To fall from reason was to slip down that chain, away from divine likeness and toward chaos. Madness, then, was not neutral. It threatened the order of the world. The afflicted could not simply be ill. They represented the ever-present risk of spiritual collapse. A single disordered soul reminded the village that the border between salvation and ruin was perilously thin. And yet, within this same framework, there existed a paradox of mercy. Because all suffering came from God, it also carried the potential for redemption. The mad were not always despised. Sometimes they were pitied, even revered. Their torment might cleanse a community's sins, or their visions might reveal divine truth. A woman's wild prophecy could be read as holiness rather than heresy if it conformed to Scripture. The line between saint and sinner was as thin as the candle flame that lit the monastery's cell. The Church guarded this balance between fear and compassion. Scripture offered both warning and comfort. Christ had cast out demons, but he had also healed the broken-hearted. Medieval thinkers inherited that dual image and built their entire understanding of madness upon it. To cure the soul, one must first discern whether its suffering was punishment or proof of grace. Either way, the answer lay not in the body, but in the spirit. The physician might bleed the patient, but the priest held the true authority, the power to absolve, to bless, or to condemn. From a world so deeply ruled by faith, it followed naturally that the signs of a disordered mind were read as signs of a disordered soul. The medieval imagination was fluent in symbols. If every sickness had meaning, then madness was simply the most mysterious of God's languages. It could be heard in the tremor of a voice, the wildness of an eye, the uninvited laughter of someone who no longer obeyed the rhythm of the village. Every gesture carried weight. When a man spoke to himself in the road or a woman wept through the night without reason, those who heard them did not see confusion. They saw a message, the question being whether it came from heaven or from hell. Life in most towns and villages was lived in close quarters. There was little privacy and still less mystery that escaped the notice of others. To behave oddly was to invite interpretation. A house that echoed with screams or prayers at strange hours might soon be whispered about. Perhaps its inhabitant had gazed too long upon an icon and been struck by divine fire. Perhaps a demon had entered through the ear during sleep. The explanations varied, but the conclusion was the same. The natural and the supernatural were inseparable. To call someone mad was not to name an ailment, but to locate them somewhere between human and otherworldly. Many lived their entire lives on that boundary. Some were tolerated, especially if their strangeness could be absorbed into existing structures of belief. A man who wandered alone, eating little and muttering fragments of scripture, might be thought a holy hermit. His isolation gave him an aura of sanctity. He seemed to exist halfway between earth and paradise. But if his words turned bitter, or if he blasphemed, or if his raptures disturbed the order of worship, the same man might suddenly be condemned as possessed. Meaning was never fixed. A change in mood, a shift in tone, could redraw the line between divine vision and dangerous madness. Women's eccentricities were often read through domestic or moral lenses. A wife who refused her duties, a mother who rejected her child, a girl who spoke too freely, each could be seen as touched by unnatural forces. The boundaries of acceptable behaviour were narrow, and deviation was alarming. When grief or despair broke through the surface of routine, it was rarely treated as emotional suffering. Instead, it was folded into existing narratives of temptation, lust, or sin. A woman who wailed at night might be fighting unseen demons, or she might have given herself to them. In either case, her body became the stage on which the spiritual battle was fought. Children were no exception to this cosmic scrutiny. A boy who spoke in tongues or shrieked at shadows could be taken as proof of divine testing, or of parental failure. Families feared that a cursed child could bring ruin upon the household. Remedies were spiritual rather than medical. Relics laid on the brow, prayers whispered in the dark. Holy water sprinkled over the cradle. Sometimes these rituals calmed the afflicted, but more often they simply reassured the observers that something had been done. In a world without psychiatry or secular medicine, prayer was both diagnosis and cure. Compassion and fear coexisted uneasily. To pity the afflicted was a Christian duty, but to approach them carried risk. The madness of another could spread, not by contagion of the body, but by proximity to sin or demonic presence. The wrong touch, the wrong word, might draw misfortune onto the family. And so, charity was often performed from a safe distance. Bread was left on a doorstep, water set at the edge of the field. Some were helped, others quietly avoided. What mattered was not healing, but containment, the maintenance of spiritual order within the community. Madness also functioned as moral lesson. Tales of the mad were retold as warnings. The proud merchant who mocked a priest and lost his wits. The lustful widow who danced alone until her mind fractured. The scholar who sought forbidden knowledge and was struck senseless by God. Each story restored the idea of balance. If madness could be traced to a cause, greed, envy, pride, then it could be understood, and therefore feared less. But when no cause could be found, when a gentle or pious soul suddenly broke apart, it unsettled the entire village. The mystery of divine justice deepened. What if innocence offered no protection? There were few consistent ways to separate divine inspiration from delusion. A person who claimed visions might attract followers or accusations, depending on timing and tone. A vision that supported church teaching could elevate one to sainthood. One that challenged it could lead to chains or fire. The content of madness was less important than its usefulness. Authority decided which voices belonged to God. Those who spoke too freely learned that revelation could quickly become heresy. Over time, certain physical signs became associated with the afflicted. Wild hair, unkempt dress, sudden laughter, or silence. All were read as outward signs of inward disarray. Medieval texts describe the melancholic, the frenzied, the possessed, each category reflecting a different balance of sin, sorrow, and suffering. But these were not medical diagnoses. They were moral portraits. To describe a man as melancholic was to say that his soul had sunk under the weight of the world, not that his brain produced too little of a chemical no one yet imagined. Communities adapted as best they could. Some found a place for the gentle mad, the harmless wanderer who muttered prayers, the child who smiled at nothing. They became part of the social fabric, woven into the rhythms of daily life, like eccentric saints. Others were less fortunate. Those who grew violent or unpredictable were restrained, sometimes with ropes, sometimes with superstition. They might be locked in barns, tethered to posts, or sent into the wilderness with a blessing and a warning. The logic was not cruelty, but fear. The fear that madness was contagious, that proximity to the unclean could summon divine punishment. Every response reflected the limits of understanding. The afflicted were both within and outside the community, fed, prayed for, but never fully human in the eyes of others. Their condition was a living sermon, a daily reminder that the mind was fragile and the soul uncertain. The people around them did not look for causes, they looked for meaning. They saw in madness a reflection of their own doubts, their own guilt, their own trembling faith. And so they named it, prayed over it, and kept their distance. Yet as the centuries moved forward, some cases grew too strange, too persistent, or too terrifying for village custom to contain. When the limits of household care and village superstition were reached, the afflicted were carried to the church. The same faith that had defined their suffering now claimed the duty of their salvation. Monasteries, convents, and hospitals attached to cathedrals became places of custody, half sanctuary, half prison. Behind their stone walls, madness was not only endured but ritualized. To suffer under holy supervision was to be purified. To be abandoned was to be lost forever. In the medieval imagination, there was no separation between healing and redemption. Every cure was an act of the soul. Within these institutions, monks and nuns served as caretakers, confessors, and sometimes witnesses to inexplicable torment. The church did not see itself as punishing the mad, but as sheltering them from the snares of the devil. A soul broken by frenzy could still be saved through discipline. The afflicted were placed in small cells or infirmary chambers near the chapel, where the air smelled of incense and stone dust. Here they might be watched by novices or older brothers assigned to the infirmary, men known as infirmarians who copied scripture by day and listened to cries by night. It was a quiet form of guardianship, shaped as much by obedience as by compassion. The treatments reflected theology rather than medicine. Prayer was constant, as though repetition could drown out the voices that troubled the mind. The afflicted were urged to confess, to fast, and to endure physical hardship as proof of penitence. Holy water was sprinkled upon the brow. Relics of saints were pressed to the chest. Psalms were sung until exhaustion became silence. Bleeding and purging, borrowed from the medical theories of the day, were sanctified through ritual. The removal of bile became the casting out of sin. When the patient fainted, it was said that the devil had been driven out. The church offered structure to chaos, a rhythm to what had once seemed meaningless. There were moments of mercy within these cloisters. Some monks recorded the words of the mad, treating them as glimpses into spiritual realms inaccessible to reason. A few even described them with awe, noting their intensity of faith and strange clarity of vision. Yet more often, such reverence gave way to fear. A person who spoke too vividly of their visions risked being seen not as blessed but as possessed. The same symptom could earn pity or punishment depending on who interpreted it. In a world defined by hierarchy, interpretation was power. The Church's reasoning was sincere, if severe. It began from the belief that all human suffering originated in the fall, that the broken mind, like the diseased body, testified to humanity's separation from God. To heal was to restore the original harmony between soul and Creator. The afflicted, therefore, were not merely patients, they were spiritual battlegrounds. Their cure required cooperation with grace, which could only be achieved through submission. In practice, this meant obedience to the Church's regimen of prayer, discipline, and pain. To resist was to prove the presence of the demonic. Pain held a special theological value. The crucifixion taught that suffering could redeem. Therefore, to inflict it was not necessarily cruelty, but correction. Flagellation, fasting, and sensory deprivation became methods of purification. A soul humbled through pain might be freed from sin's grip. They believed that the path to healing ran through the imitation of Christ's agony. If the body screamed, it was only the devil leaving. Records from monastic infirmaries show that many of these custodial practices were improvised, shaped by local custom and belief. In some places, the disordered were chained to walls for their own safety. In others, they were allowed to wander the cloister garden in silence. A few orders, like the Benedictines and the Hospitallers, kept infirmaries where the mad and the sick shared space, equal in their need for salvation. The distinction between physical and mental illness was barely recognized. Both were signs of spiritual disturbance, and both demanded purification. Yet within this system of holy care, contradiction thrived. The Church preached mercy, but feared contamination. The afflicted were close to the divine, but also dangerously close to the demonic. They were kept near the chapel to receive blessings, but often isolated from the community to preserve order. Compassion required distance. The more visibly a person suffered, the more ambiguous their holiness became. Some monks viewed their charges as living proof of God's mysterious justice, while others saw them as vessels of temptation. The mad were both evidence of God's power and reminders of its limits. This tension extended into doctrine. Theologians debated whether madness excused sin. Could a man who blasphemed in delirium be damned? Could a woman who spoke in tongues be canonized? St. Augustine had written that the mind was the image of God, and thus its disorder represented the deepest form of corruption. Yet others, like St. Bernard and Hildegard of Bingen, recognized that visions and ecstasies, so similar to madness, could illuminate truth. Hildegard herself claimed divine revelations that blurred the line between mystical experience and hallucination. The Church alternated between reverence and suspicion, unsure where revelation ended and illness began. For the sufferers, such uncertainty meant that their fate depended entirely on context. A monk who experienced rapture during prayer might be celebrated as a mystic. A peasant who experienced the same would be feared as possessed. Class, gender, and proximity to authority shaped how one's madness was read. The church's custody system did not erase the old superstitions of the village. It simply codified them under a new hierarchy. The demons that had once haunted cottages now haunted cloisters. Even as the church offered refuge, it also absorbed madness into its moral order. To be healed was to be corrected, made obedient, brought back into alignment with divine law. Those who failed to improve were not only pitied but judged. Their continued suffering implied spiritual resistance, a hidden sin that prayer could not reach. And so, many were confined indefinitely, their silence mistaken for peace. Some monasteries kept them for years, naming them God's poor or innocents. Others were released back into the world, no better understood, but ritually purified. Whether they lived or died, their treatment affirmed the same truth. That reason belonged to God, and its loss demanded submission, not inquiry. Through these centuries of custody, the Church transformed madness from private misfortune into public theology. It became a mirror of Christian ideals, the soul in conflict, the body as instrument of redemption, the suffering as evidence of divine order. The afflicted person was both warning and promise, proof that the path to salvation was narrow, and that even despair could be sanctified if endured under holy supervision. In monasteries across Europe, the echo of their prayers and cries blended into the daily rhythm of bells and chants. Madness had found its place within the architecture of faith. The Church's custodianship of the mad soon deepened into a problem of interpretation. If every thought was touched by God, and every deviation from reason had a cause in heaven or hell, then each act of madness demanded judgment. Monks, priests, and theologians tried to read the mind's distortions as they would read a passage of scripture. But their conclusions never settled. The afflicted seemed to speak two languages at once, one divine, one damned, and even the most learned among them could not always tell which was which. Medieval theology drew no clean line between revelation and delirium. The same symptoms that condemned one person could elevate another to sainthood. Visions, voices, and trances occupied an uneasy place within Christian thought, for they resembled both divine illumination and demonic deception. The Church taught that the devil could imitate holiness perfectly, whispering false revelations to the gullible. Yet saints too were said to hear voices, see light, and fall into ecstasy. The difference lay not in what they experienced, but in what the Church decided it meant. Faith was never only private, it required supervision. The soul might speak, but authority had the final word. This tension can be traced through the stories of those who blurred the boundary between sanity and sanctity. The lives of saints are filled with signs that, in another context, would have been labelled madness. Saint Dymphna fled her father's lust and was beheaded for refusing him. Her cult later grew around the care of the mentally afflicted. Saint Vitus was said to cause uncontrollable dancing in those who prayed to him. A frenzy so violent it sometimes ended in death. Each became a symbol of holy suffering, yet their behaviour, ecstasy, fasting, self-harm, echoed the very symptoms that brought others to confinement. Holiness and insanity shared a common language. The Church's scholars sought to systematise this chaos. They wrote manuals for confessors, treatises on possession, and catalogues of miracles, each attempting to separate divine from diabolic influence. Thomas Aquinas argued that demonic possession involved an external force invading the body, while mental disturbance arose from within, through the corruption of imagination or memory. Others insisted that the devil could seize both mind and flesh, disguising spiritual illness as bodily pain. In every explanation, madness remained a symptom of imbalance between the human and the divine. The physician might observe it, but only the theologian could interpret it. Scripture offered models but no clarity. King Saul's tormenting spirit, Nebuchadnezzar's madness in the wilderness, Mary Magdalene's 7 demons, all could be read as punishment or purification. Christ himself healed the possessed, yet sometimes allowed their suffering to reveal the power of faith. To medieval thinkers, these stories confirmed that the boundaries of the mind were battlegrounds of salvation. Every outcry, every trembling fit, was a small echo of cosmic struggle. The afflicted soul was never entirely its own. It was property contested by invisible forces. Public exorcisms became extensions of this theology. The ritual was both medicine and spectacle. Holy water, relics, and the recitation of Latin formulas meant to drive out the intruder. When the afflicted screamed or convulsed, the crowd saw proof that evil had been exposed. When silence followed, it was taken as victory. Yet many of those declared cured continued to suffer, their symptoms returning after the priest departed. The church's power could soothe, but rarely resolve. The demonic and the divine were too closely entwined to be neatly separated. Fear of deception haunted even the most devout observers. The devil, they believed, was patient, subtle, and skilled in imitation. A false miracle could damn the gullible as surely as open sin. As a result, claims of vision or revelation were treated with suspicion. Those who spoke of hearing voices were often subjected to examination by clerics, who questioned not only their words, but their bodies. Were their eyes steady? Did they tremble? Could they quote scripture without error? A misstep might expose the presence of deceit. For many, faith itself became a kind of test one could fail. The paradox extended to punishment. If madness was sent by God as trial, to resist it might be blasphemy. Yet if it was sent by the devil, to tolerate it was dangerous. The afflicted stood at the intersection of pity and threat. Their suffering inspired charity, but their unpredictability demanded control. Confessionals became a kind of therapy, though one rooted in guilt rather than understanding. The penitent was urged to name every impure thought, every doubt, as if clarity could save them from error. The priest listened, recorded, and absolved, or prescribed further penance if the confusion persisted. Sin was treated as contagion. It could be forgiven but not ignored. The image of the devil occupied enormous imaginative space in medieval life. Pain, lust, and despair all bore his mark. When a person's reason fractured, the devil's hand was assumed. Demons were said to take residence in the stomach, the lungs, even the tongue. They could speak through their victims, cursing the holy and confessing their crimes. Monks kept lists of symptoms: refusal of the sacraments, violent strength, knowledge of hidden things. But the same behaviour could also appear in those claimed by religious ecstasy. A woman in trance might recite scripture fluently despite illiteracy. Was she possessed or inspired? The answer depended less on her behaviour than on who stood beside her when she spoke. Mystics occupied this dangerous space with uneasy grace. Their visions brought comfort to the faithful, but also threatened the Church's monopoly on revelation. Julian of Norwich described her visions of Christ bleeding into the world with serene certainty. Hildegard of Bingen painted her divine illuminations in precise geometric forms. Yet both women were scrutinized before being accepted as genuine prophets. Countless others, less articulate, less protected, were silenced, their experiences dismissed as delusion or witchcraft. The Church's desire to control meaning made even miracles suspect. This tension bled into broader social life. If madness could signify holiness, Anyone might claim divine authority. To prevent chaos, the Church established criteria for sainthood that combined evidence of virtue with demonstrations of control. True saints obeyed hierarchy. Their ecstasies served doctrine rather than disrupted it. Those who resisted clerical oversight, who preached alone, challenged priests, or acted outside liturgy, risked condemnation as heretics. In this way, the Church's treatment of madness mirrored its treatment of dissent. Both were disorders threatening the unity of faith. Sin provided the final interpretive net. Where reason failed, morality supplied explanation. The mad were examined not only for symptoms, but for guilt. Pride, gluttony, lust, or envy could each twist the soul until it mirrored the devil's image. Madness thus became an extension of sin, a visible reflection of invisible decay. Those who suffered without obvious cause were urged to repent of hidden faults. Their affliction was proof enough that something inside them had turned away from God. To confess was to participate in healing, even when the confession could not restore reason. This moralization of madness offered both comfort and cruelty. It reassured the sane that order still existed, that suffering had purpose, that the universe remained just. But it left little room for innocence. To lose one's mind was to invite suspicion. To suffer without reason was to risk accusation. Families prayed that their loved one's torment might be seen as divine rather than diabolic. For holiness at least promised honour. Possession brought only shame. When faith began to strain under the weight of mystery, medicine stepped cautiously into the conversation. The physicians of the Middle Ages inherited a world still ruled by theology, yet they sought order in the body rather than the heavens. Their art was not yet science in any modern sense. It was a blend of philosophy, astrology, and ritual. They read the stars as carefully as they studied flesh, believing the two were bound by invisible harmony. Madness to them was not a sign of divine warfare, but of imbalance, an excess or deficiency of the fluids that governed human temperament. The soul remained God's domain, but the body, they thought, could be persuaded toward peace. This new authority traced its lineage to Galen, the Greek physician, whose writings survived in monasteries and Arabic translations. According to his humoral theory, the body contained 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each corresponded to an element, a season, and a personality. Health was the equilibrium of these forces. Illness was their discord. The mind, though unnamed as such, was believed to suffer when black bile grew thick or when heat rose to the head. The melancholic temperament, marked by sorrow and withdrawal, was linked to cold and dryness. Frenzy or mania was caused by heat and moisture. Madness, therefore, was not random, it was mechanical, the symptom of an unbalanced universe contained within the flesh. The physician's tools reflected this philosophy. He approached the afflicted not as a sinner or a vessel of demons, but as a malfunctioning system. The cure lay in restoration of balance, bleeding to release excess humours, purging to cleanse the stomach, baths to cool the blood, and dietary adjustments to realign temperament. Herbs were prescribed according to their elemental properties. Mint soothed heat, sage steadied moisture, and vinegar cooled a fevered spirit. For melancholia, hellebore was the favoured remedy, though its toxicity made the cure as dangerous as the disease. Each treatment was as symbolic as it was physical, a ritual of purification that echoed the Church's sacraments. Yet even these physicians did not step far from faith. Before beginning any treatment, they consulted the stars. The movement of planets determined auspicious times for bleeding or bathing, and the moon's phase could decide whether a cure succeeded or failed. Astrology was not superstition, but structure, a divine map of the body's inner weather. The human form was thought to mirror the cosmos. Veins like rivers, organs like planets, the head the seat of heaven itself. To heal the body was to restore cosmic order. And so a physician might stand beside a priest, each working from different sides of the same mystery. One prayed, the other bled, but both sought to draw the soul back toward alignment with its creator. Medical texts of the time, such as those translated from Arabic scholars like Avicenna, combined anatomy with theology in equal measure. Avicenna's canon of medicine described the brain as the seat of perception and imagination, yet still under divine control. He wrote of melancholy as both physical and moral, rooted in the body but coloured by the soul's condition. European scholars adopted these ideas with reverence, copying them into illuminated manuscripts, the libraries of universities and monasteries. The physician became a learned man, distinct from the barber surgeon or the apothecary, yet still deferential to the church. His authority ended where the soul began. The practice of treatment was as much performance as care. Patients were examined through sight, sound and scent. The colour of the skin, the tone of the voice, the odour of the breath all revealed the state of the humours. Physicians recorded their findings in Latin, diagnosing melancholia, mania or frenzy. They might order bloodletting from the forearm under the right moon, followed by immersion in a cold bath, a rest in shaded air, and a diet of boiled vegetables. If the patient continued to rave, they were urged toward pilgrimage, healing through motion, through proximity to holy places. The journey itself, with its hardship and prayer, was believed to cleanse the mind. Those who could not travel were given relics to touch or holy oil to swallow, uniting medicine and miracle in a single gesture. Even in its most rational form, medieval medicine could not disentangle itself from moral meaning. The body was not a mechanism to be fixed, but a mirror of the soul's virtue. Excessive desire, anger, or grief could unbalance the humours, proving that emotion itself was both cause and consequence of disorder. Physicians spoke of passions of the heart and vapours of the spleen, describing invisible processes with the same certainty that monks spoke of angels. Madness, whether gentle melancholy or violent frenzy, became the ultimate expression of humanity's frailty. Neither wholly physical nor wholly spiritual, but suspended between the two. Those who sought medical help often did so after exhausting prayer. A family might bring their afflicted kin first to the priest for confession and blessing, then to the physician for bleeding. Both men might recommend fasting, both might advise humility. Failure of the cure was rarely blamed on error. It was taken as proof that God's purpose lay beyond human reach. If a patient improved, the doctor thanked divine mercy. If they worsened, he advised further penance. Medicine existed not to challenge theology, but to accompany it, translating spiritual imbalance into the language of the body. Despite their learning, medieval doctors remained close to superstition. Many carried amulets or wore herbs around their necks for protection. They treated dreams as diagnostic clues and prescribed charms against nightmares. Some used music to calm agitation, believing harmony could soothe the humours. Others advised exposure to sunlight or moonlight in careful moderation. It was an age when the line between natural and supernatural had not yet been drawn, and to study one was to invoke the other. A physician might recite the names of saints while lancing a vein, convinced that healing required both steady hands and holy words. As cities grew and universities expanded, medicine became a profession marked by hierarchy. Wealth determined access. Noble families could afford physicians trained in Salerno or Montpellier, while peasants relied on midwives, herbalists, and cunning folk. These local healers blended folk practice with Christian faith, muttering prayers over poultices and blessing herbs before use. Their cures were often dismissed by scholars as ignorant, yet they persisted because they worked often enough to be believed. The medical world, like the spiritual one, was a spectrum, formal, informal, official, forbidden, all orbiting the same unanswered question of why the mind breaks. For all its complexity, medieval medicine remained powerless against true madness. It could ease fever, soothe the body, and drain the blood, but it could not touch the invisible storms of thought. The physician might note improvement in the patient's sleep or appetite, but the wild eyes, the strange laughter, the disordered speech remained. When the humours resisted balance, the doctor stepped back and crossed himself. The language of the body had failed, and the matter returned to that of the soul. Some patients were sent to monasteries for further care. Others were released to wander again, marked as incurable. The learned world could describe the mechanisms of madness, but could not cure them. When the remedies of faith and medicine failed, the burden of care settled once more upon the shoulders of the village. The physician's departure left behind a familiar silence, the sound of ordinary people facing a mystery too large for prayer or logic. There were no institutions in most places, no hospitals or monasteries within reach. The afflicted lived among neighbours who had known them since birth, who remembered them as children before their minds began to stray. This closeness bred both pity and fear. Madness, stripped of its sacred trappings, became something intimate, uncomfortable, and terribly human. Life in the medieval village revolved around survival. Every able body mattered, and every deviation from order threatened the fragile balance that kept hunger at bay. A man who refused to work, a woman who screamed through the night, or a child who vanished into trances became a disruption as much as a tragedy. The community's patience was measured in harvests and winters. Compassion had to compete with necessity. Families bore the first responsibility, keeping their afflicted kin at home, if possible. They tied them gently during fits, kept sharp tools out of reach, and prayed that quiet days would return. But when the raving grew constant, or the violence spread, care turned to concealment. A relative might be locked in a shed, or left to wander at the edge of the fields, where their cries disturbed no one. The line between protection and exile was impossibly thin. Folklore filled the space that theology and medicine could not occupy. The moon, with its shifting light and restless pull, was believed to influence the mind. Those who grew strange or sleepless were said to be moonstruck, their thoughts drawn out of joint by its cold glow. The term lunatic came naturally, carrying both poetry and dread. On clear nights, mothers hurried their children indoors, fearing the moon's stare. Madness became a rhythm of light and dark, a reflection of nature's own instability. People did not question whether it was true. It simply felt consistent with the world they knew, where weather shaped moods and illness followed the seasons. Other explanations reached deeper into the landscape of superstition. In parts of rural Europe, madness was attributed to fairies or spirits who toyed with the minds of mortals. The afflicted were said to have been touched or taken, their souls half carried into another realm. They might wake from sleep with new voices, new fears, or knowledge they could not explain. In some regions, small rituals were performed to bring them back. Herbs burned at the threshold, charms made from iron nails, prayers whispered at the crossroads. The afflicted were sometimes led in circles under the full moon, or bathed in running water, believed to confuse the spirits that possessed them. These acts were not cruel, they were desperate forms of hope, rooted in the conviction that madness was reversible if only the right balance of courage and faith could be found. At times, the community accepted the afflicted as part of its fabric, especially when their behaviour could be contained or interpreted. A quiet wanderer who muttered prayers might be viewed as a harmless fool, a figure both pitied and tolerated. Children were warned not to mock them, for the fool's angel was said to listen closely. Some even gained a kind of sanctity, their eccentricities mistaken for divine favour. They were fed, given odd jobs, and treated with a mix of amusement and reverence. In this way, small villages created a fragile ecosystem of tolerance, one that allowed difference to survive, so long as it did not disrupt the collective rhythm. But such mercy had limits. When disorder turned violent, or when hunger and fear tightened the heart, tolerance collapsed. The afflicted who shouted blasphemies or struck at others were seen as dangerous, not merely to themselves but to the moral order of the community. Their presence seemed to invite misfortune. Failed crops, dying cattle, sick children. Superstition offered simple connections between unrelated events, and the mad became easy scapegoats. A family's tragedy could be explained by the neighbour's strange son, whose vacant stare now seemed prophetic. Fear required containment, and containment required exclusion. These acts of exclusion rarely came as formal punishment. There were no judges for madness, only consensus. A council of elders, or simply a gathering of neighbours, might decide that a man's rages had become too great a risk. He would be led beyond the boundary of the village, perhaps with a loaf of bread and a cross for protection, and told not to return. In some places, local legends spoke of wild men who roamed the woods, covered in leaves and living off roots, a half-real, half-symbolic image of humanity without reason. Whether any of these outcasts survived long is uncertain, but their imagined presence haunted the borders of every settlement. They represented what happened when community could no longer contain difference. Those who remained within the village often lived in a shadowed half-life. A madwoman might be kept in a small room near the hearth, fed but seldom spoken to. A father might build a hut at the edge of his property for a son whose fits frightened the livestock. The afflicted became household ghosts, visible but absent, living reminders of divine mystery and human limitation. Visitors crossed themselves before entering such homes, whispering short prayers to Saint Dymphna or St. Mary for protection. It was understood that madness could not be cured, only endured, and endurance itself became an act of faith. The economy of compassion was uneven. Wealthier families could hire caretakers or send their afflicted to distant monasteries. The poor had only each other. Among them, small networks of mutual aid sometimes formed, neighbours sharing food, offering to watch the afflicted for an afternoon, so others could work. Yet exhaustion wore everyone down. The burden of care consumed time, labour, and hope. When fatigue turned to shame, even kindness could become cruelty. The afflicted might be mocked in public, baited for entertainment, or paraded in festivals as examples of divine punishment. Laughter offered relief from fear, but it also stripped away dignity. Still, there were moments of quiet grace. Not every community met madness with scorn. Some saw in the afflicted a reflection of their own precarious humanity. Chronic illness, grief, hunger, all blurred the line between sanity and suffering. A farmer who lost his family to plague might sit staring into the distance for hours, and no one called him possessed. They said only that sorrow had taken him. In such distinctions, one can glimpse the beginnings of empathy, though it had no language to sustain itself. People knew madness when they saw it, but they also recognized the fragility that made it possible in anyone. Seasonal rituals provided small frameworks for control. During certain feasts, villagers reenacted chaos in controlled form. Festivals of fools, carnivals, and processions where rules were inverted and laughter reigned. For a few days, disorder became communal, blessed by custom. The mad could dance among the sane, and no one feared contamination. When the feast ended, order returned with renewed force, and those same individuals were quietly pushed back to the margins. In this alternation between inclusion and exclusion, the community reaffirmed its own boundaries. Madness served as both warning and release. As medieval villages swelled into towns and towns hardened into cities, the intimacy that once bound people to their afflicted neighbours began to fade. What had once been a personal responsibility became a civic problem. The sight of the mad wandering streets or muttering in doorways disturbed the fragile sense of public order that urban life demanded. The same communities that had once tolerated difference under the banner of faith now saw disorder as contagion. And so, compassion retreated behind walls. By the late Middle Ages, Europe began to confine what it no longer wished to see. The earliest sites of confinement were rarely built with mercy in mind. Disused castles, crumbling fortresses, and the basements of hospitals were transformed into holding places for those who could not be cured or controlled. Monasteries that once offered prayerful shelter found their cells overflowing and began sending the violent or incurable to secular institutions. Almshouses, designed for the poor and the aged, absorbed the distracted alongside the destitute. The same stone chambers that had once echoed with hymns now held cries and silence in equal measure. In these spaces, charity and punishment became indistinguishable. Confinement was justified as protection, both for society and for the afflicted themselves. Town authorities argued that the mad needed restraint to prevent harm, that darkness and solitude would quiet their fevered minds. The logic was practical, not malicious, but the result was cruelty disguised as order. Straw on damp floors replaced beds. Iron replaced prayer. Chains were affixed to walls and wrists, heavy enough to prevent wandering, but light enough to allow kneeling. The cell became both confessional and cage, a place where madness could be managed without the burden of care. These early asylums were not designed around understanding, but containment. They served as warehouses for difference, gathering the poor, the criminal, and the mad into a single category of the ungovernable. Each body behind the walls justified the city's claim to cleanliness beyond them. To walk the streets free of lunatics was to believe civilization had triumphed. But inside, the same chaos persisted, only hidden. Hunger, filth, and neglect replaced community supervision. The cries that once echoed across fields now resounded in corridors of stone. Records from hospitals in Paris and London describe wards where dozens of people shared a single windowless room. Some were chained to posts, others were bound to their beds. Guards rather than healers watched over them. The mingling of prisoners and patients blurred every distinction between sin and sickness. A thief might share a cell with a man who raved at angels. Women arrested for prostitution or adultery were sometimes labelled distracted and confined alongside those who had simply lost their wits. In the eyes of the city, all were symptoms of the same disorder, an affront to the moral and social order that demanded correction. Treatment, when attempted, followed the same principles of restraint. Cold baths were thought to shock the mind back into reason. Fasting and beating were administered as purgatives for the soul. Priests occasionally visited to offer confession, but absolution did not open the cell door. Physicians came less frequently, and when they did, they treated their visits as observation rather than intervention. The patients were curiosities, evidence of divine mystery or moral failure, depending on the observer's conviction. To study them was to affirm the hierarchy of sanity, not to challenge it. Within these institutions, the boundaries between mercy and cruelty dissolved entirely. The church still preached compassion, yet the city demanded control. The poor were fed only enough to survive, the violent subdued with blows. The afflicted who sang hymns were tolerated. Those who cursed were beaten. Madness that resembled piety was seen as harmless, but madness that resembled rebellion invited punishment. The institutions reflected not only the fragility of human understanding, but the fear of social collapse. To chain the mad was to reassure the sane that their own minds remained intact. The environment itself was a form of erasure. Cells were small and unlit, airless in summer and freezing in winter. Straw turned to rot and water mixed with waste. Inmates, if they could still be called patients, spoke less as the months passed, their words fading into mutters and hums. Some tore their clothes, others refused food. A few fell into silence so profound that visitors mistook them for dead. When actual death came, it caused little disturbance. A body could be replaced more easily than an idea. The institution's purpose was not to heal individuals, but to preserve order, and order required a steady population of the confined. Outside the walls, public opinion began to change in subtle ways. Madness, once feared as divine or demonic, became increasingly mundane. It was now something civic, a disorder of behaviour rather than spirit. The shift from theology to policy did not humanise the afflicted, it only simplified their categorisation. To call someone mad was no longer to question their soul, but to measure their usefulness. Those who could not contribute to the labour of the city became liabilities. Confinement offered an efficient solution. It turned moral failure into logistical containment. The language of charity endured, but its meaning had thinned. Donations were collected for the comfort of the poor and the insane, though little comfort reached the cells. Religious orders justified their cooperation by invoking the virtue of obedience. Secular authorities invoked the necessity of discipline. Both claimed to serve the greater good. Yet behind every iron door, humanity was reduced to endurance. The afflicted no longer existed as individuals in need of salvation, but as examples of what society wished to exclude. Some chroniclers, disturbed by what they witnessed, wrote cautiously of the conditions. They described institutions where the mad sat naked in darkness, where their moans were mistaken for prayer, where food was passed through bars and forgotten. But even these witnesses accepted confinement as inevitable. Madness, they believed, could not live among the sane. Isolation was the only mercy left when neither medicine nor theology could bring relief. The idea that restraint itself might deepen suffering belonged to a future age not yet imaginable. In this landscape of iron and silence, the very concept of care was redefined. To feed without freedom, to shelter without warmth, to preserve life without dignity. These became acceptable substitutes for compassion. The city, cleansed of its visible disorder, congratulated itself on its progress. Inside the walls, progress meant only survival. Madness had been moved out of sight and therefore out of conscience. The afflicted no longer frightened the world, they merely served as its shadow. Even within the walls of confinement, a quiet hierarchy took root. Madness was not judged equally. The same fevered raving that made a man pitied could make a woman condemned. In the dim cells of hospitals and the narrow chambers of monasteries, female suffering was interpreted through lenses of sin and obedience. Where men's madness suggested the tragic collapse of reason, women's madness was seen as confirmation of weakness, indulgence, or moral failure. The female body, already burdened with associations of temptation and disorder, became the preferred vessel for society's fears. In medieval theology, womanhood was bound to the story of Eve, curiosity punished, defiance immortalized. Every trace of rebellion, every whisper of pain could be folded back into that original transgression. If a woman wept too long, laughed too freely, or spoke too passionately, her behaviour was rarely viewed as symptom, it was evidence. To lose composure was to reveal one's nature. The mad woman was not simply ill, she was dangerous because she reminded the world of the instability it already suspected in her sex. Her suffering needed no cause beyond herself. The language of medicine did little to protect her. Physicians adapted the ancient idea of the wandering womb, a belief that the uterus moved through the body like a restless creature, pressing against organs and disturbing the mind. Madness in women was thus imagined as a consequence of their own anatomy, a product of internal rebellion. It was called hysteria, from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. Treatments focused on restoring submission rather than healing. Women were bled more frequently than men, purged to calm their tempers, or advised to marry quickly so that their passions might be properly directed. Even within the supposed rationality of medicine, control replaced compassion. Religious interpretation reached further still. Visions and voices that granted men sainthood led women to suspicion. A monk who fasted and heard angels was blessed. A woman who did the same risked being named possessed. The Church's discomfort with female mysticism revealed its deeper anxiety about authority. The body of a holy man symbolized obedience to God, but the body of a visionary woman threatened the hierarchy that governed faith. Her intimacy with the divine was too direct, too uncontrolled, and so women who claimed revelation were subjected to scrutiny. Some were examined by priests and found pure, others were questioned until confession turned to condemnation. The witchcraft persecutions that would later sweep across Europe grew from this soil of suspicion. What began as theological curiosity hardened into institutional fear. Female knowledge, especially knowledge of herbs, childbirth and healing, was redefined as dangerous power. Midwives, herbalists and widows who lived without male oversight became easy targets. Their skill in easing pain or predicting storms seemed unnatural. Their independence, a quiet rebellion against divine order. When madness appeared in the community, it was often these women who were blamed for summoning it. Possession was reinterpreted as witchcraft, and compassion dissolved into accusation. Torture became both investigation and cure. Interrogators sought to extract the truth that theology demanded, a pact with the devil, a confession of unnatural acts, a catalogue of names whispered in darkness. Madness and sin merged into a single narrative. Women were not victims of unseen forces, but collaborators with them. Their screams, recorded by clerks in court documents, were later read as evidence of guilt. Pain, in the logic of the time, purified the soul, but also revealed deceit. If a woman endured torture without breaking, it was proof that demons protected her. If she confessed quickly, it confirmed her corruption. There was no path to innocence, only degrees of condemnation. The symbolism of female madness extended beyond the courtroom. In sermons and art, women were depicted as instruments of temptation and chaos. The image of the mad woman, wild-haired, half-naked, eyes turned upward, became a warning about the dangers of passion, ungoverned by faith. Painters and preachers alike used her to illustrate the fall from virtue, contrasting her frenzy with the calm of the Virgin Mary. Where male saints fought visible demons, women were expected to fight themselves. Their bodies became battlegrounds for virtue, their minds theatres for sin. Even within monastic life, the disparity persisted. Nuns who claimed visions were examined by confessors to ensure their revelations aligned with doctrine. A woman who saw angels too vividly risked the accusation of vanity. One who resisted her confessor's guidance could be declared deluded. Some convents quietly confined their mystics, fearing scandal more than sanctity. Records speak of women kept in silence, their ecstatic writings burned or censored. A few were canonized after death, but many vanished into the archives as sisters afflicted by melancholy. Holiness for women had to be carefully managed. Ecstasy constrained to obedience, inspiration disguised as humility. In rural communities, the same fears manifested in smaller, more brutal ways. A woman who spoke to herself might be avoided. One who cursed her husband could be beaten into reason. The notion that female madness was contagious, spreading through gossip, laughter, or seduction, fed the belief that women's emotions needed constant supervision. Husbands, fathers, and priests positioned themselves as guardians against this imagined threat. They prescribed silence, work, and isolation as cures. Some women submitted, others broke under the weight of such control. Madness, once born of misunderstanding, was now manufactured by the very structures meant to contain it. The cruelty of these measures was often hidden beneath the language of salvation. The Church claimed to act for the soul's benefit, the physician for the body's health, and the husband for the household's peace. Yet all three forms of authority shared a single aim: to restore hierarchy. In many towns, public trials of supposed witches or demoniacs became communal rituals of reassurance. Villagers gathered to watch exorcisms or executions, convinced that every scream confirmed the triumph of good over evil. Women who once lived at the margins of society now served as warnings to the rest of it. Their madness, whether genuine or invented, was displayed as a spectacle of moral purification. The stage of faith had widened to include fire, rope, and judgment. Behind these performances lay a more private tragedy. For every woman burned or chained, there were countless others who suffered quietly, their despair mistaken for sin, their grief treated as rebellion. A widow's mourning might be called possession. A mother's silence after childbirth might be labelled hysteria. The vocabulary of control grew more elaborate even as understanding withered. What could not be healed was punished. What could not be explained was condemned. By the late Middle Ages, faith had learned to perform itself. Ritual, once confined to cloister and chapel, spilled into streets and squares. Processions, pilgrimages, and miracle plays turned devotion into theatre, and salvation became something to be seen as much as believed. In this climate of public piety, madness could no longer remain a private sorrow. The afflicted body, trembling, muttering, and ungoverned, was reimagined as spectacle, a living sermon for those who watched. The Church understood that the visible carried power. The sight of sin purged, the sound of demons expelled, the dramatic moment of healing. All these fed the hunger of a world desperate for signs of divine presence. As cathedrals rose and relics multiplied, the mad found themselves drawn into this expanding theatre of faith. Their suffering became part of the choreography of belief. If pain could reveal the invisible, then the afflicted were indispensable, proof that the spiritual battle between good and evil was still being waged upon the earth. Exorcisms, once whispered in private, now unfolded before crowds. Priests chanted in Latin, while assistants held down the writhing body of the possessed. Candles flickered, incense thickened the air, and every cry from the sufferer was met with gasps or prayers from the onlookers. The audience believed itself participating in the ritual, each spectator a witness to the triumph of holiness over corruption. When the afflicted fell still or wept in exhaustion, it was taken as victory. The demon had been expelled, the priest sanctified, and the crowd renewed in its conviction. Yet for the one on the floor, panting and dazed, there was rarely peace. Many left such rituals as they had entered, bewildered, trembling, and forgotten once the applause of piety had died. Healing shrines offered a more polished version of the same drama. Sites dedicated to saints known for miraculous cures. Most famously, Saint Dymphna, Saint Vitus, and Saint Mary Magdalene attracted pilgrims from across Christendom. The journey itself was an act of hope and humiliation. The afflicted were led on foot or carried in carts, their families chanting prayers as they approached the holy site. At the shrine, priests anointed them with oil, washed them in sacred springs, or pressed relics against their skin. Around them, crowds watched, as though attending a ritual play. Some pilgrims claimed instant recovery, rising from their knees to shout praises. Others convulsed, screamed, or fainted, their pain read as proof that the devil was being forced out. Miracles were rare, but expectation was powerful. The few who appeared healed were celebrated, their stories copied into hagiographies as evidence of divine mercy. For everyone restored to calm, dozens returned home, unchanged. Their failure to recover was never seen as failure of the ritual, but as proof of lingering sin or weak faith. The structure of the spectacle demanded that someone remain afflicted. Without suffering, there could be no miracle. Without madness, no sanctity to prove against it. Public fascination with the strange and the possessed grew alongside the church's need to demonstrate control. Travelling holy men and friars capitalized on this hunger, conducting mass healings and exorcisms wherever crowds gathered. In marketplaces, they invoked the names of saints while sprinkling holy water on those who trembled. The line between devotion and entertainment blurred. Street performers imitated the raving of demoniacs for laughter, while pious dramatists reenacted biblical possessions for moral instruction. Madness had become a kind of theatre, terrifying, instructive, and strangely familiar. These performances offered reassurance to a society haunted by uncertainty. The medieval mind saw the world as precariously balanced between order and chaos, salvation and damnation. To witness madness conquered was to glimpse stability restored. Each exorcism reaffirmed the power of the church. Each public healing proved that divine grace still flowed through human hands. Yet this reassurance came at the cost of those who played the part of the afflicted. Their agony, genuine or misinterpreted, became a currency of faith. They were displayed, prayed over, and discarded, their humanity subsumed by the lesson their bodies were made to teach. Women bore the heaviest share of this transformation. The female demoniac became an emblem of both temptation and triumph. Her scream symbolized resistance to God, her collapse, submission to his will. Artists painted her in chains, priests wrote sermons about her redemption, and playwrights turned her ordeal into moral allegory. Whether saint or sinner, she existed to demonstrate contrast, the purity of faith against the chaos of the flesh. Audiences learned to read her suffering as necessary, even beautiful, proof of the church's power to cleanse the unclean. Not all spectacles were sanctioned by clergy. In some towns, possession and madness became part of local law, spreading from person to person in outbreaks that baffled authorities. Groups of women or adolescents would begin convulsing or dancing uncontrollably, sometimes for days. The phenomenon was called Chorea Sancti Vitae, the dance of St. Vitus, and was treated as both curse and contagion. Priests led processions through the streets, carrying crosses and relics to calm the afflicted. Musicians were hired to play hymns in rhythm with the convulsions, guiding them into exhaustion. Entire towns became audiences to their own hysteria. These collective frenzies revealed the power of performance, embedded in belief. Faith shaped perception so deeply that to witness madness was to become part of it. The crowd, by reacting, confirmed its reality. The afflicted responded in turn, their spasms and shouts echoing the expectations of those who watched. The ritual fed itself until fatigue replaced fear. When it ended, there was no clear distinction between healing and surrender. Only silence, heavy with the sense that something immense had passed through. Theatres of faith sometimes blurred into spectacles of punishment. Those accused of witchcraft or false miracles were displayed before trial, paraded through towns as warnings. Their madness, real or fabricated, was cited as evidence of their guilt. The more they raged, the more certain the crowd became. Public humiliation served as both entertainment and instruction, reminding the faithful of the peril of doubt. In these moments, the border between religious ceremony and civic order dissolved completely. The city square became a temporary cathedral, and the suffering body its altar. For the church, the public ritual offered control. For the spectators, catharsis. Watching another's torment allowed them to release their own fears of sin and disorder. To see the devil defeated, or merely restrained, was to feel the fragile world briefly held together. The more visible the suffering, the greater the sense of triumph. It was not cruelty that drove the crowds, but relief. The afflicted made visible what everyone secretly feared, the possibility that reason, faith and salvation could collapse without warning. Their pain was the price of reassurance. Yet beneath these public displays lay an ocean of silence. For every exorcism performed before a congregation, hundreds of sufferers remained hidden in barns, attics and back rooms. Their madness untheatrical and therefore unacknowledged. The church could not parade them, for their agony lacked clarity. It did not fit the moral narrative of possession or miracle. Their families bore the burden quietly, feeding them, restraining them, and waiting for years that changed nothing. These unseen lives sustained the illusion that the spectacles were working, that faith had answers, that society was progressing. The medieval world, enamoured with its own rituals of proof, mistook visibility for salvation. The noise of exorcisms, the chanting of pilgrims, the rhythmic pounding of drums in the dance of St. Vitus, all these drowned the quieter truth that most madness did not end in healing. It ended in exhaustion. The afflicted were not cleansed or restored. They were simply spent, their voices worn down by prayer and time. Beneath the spectacle's bright surface, countless others endured their suffering in shadow, unhealed, unremembered, and unseen by the crowd that prayed for their deliverance. In the countryside, families carried the burden of madness as quietly as possible. To confess that a relative was touched invited shame, gossip, or the attention of authorities who offered only confinement. The solution then was concealment. Some were locked in storerooms or sleeping lofts. Others were housed in sheds or huts behind the home. They might be kept there for decades, tended with a mixture of care and resignation. The family adapted to their presence, as one adapts to weather, something to live around, neither blessing nor curse, simply fact. When strangers passed through the village, the afflicted were hidden from sight, their cries muffled by distance or denial. Silence became the truest form of protection. The daily routines of these hidden lives were monotonous, but strangely consistent. Meals were passed through doors, clothing was mended but rarely changed. The afflicted paced in circles, talked to shadows, or fell into long spells of stillness. In winter, the air froze in their breath. In summer, flies gathered around bowls of thin soup. Their families spoke of them sparingly, in the past tense even while they lived. To speak too often was to tempt despair. Compassion when it appeared was quiet and brief. A mother smoothing a blanket, a sister whispering a prayer before latching the door. Over time, even love grew ritualized, emptied of comfort, but preserved out of duty. These arrangements existed not only out of cruelty or shame, but also necessity. Poverty left few alternatives. A labourer could not abandon the fields to watch over an incoherent brother, nor could a widow feed herself and an ailing son who refused to work. The choice was not between kindness and neglect, but between survival and collapse. In such conditions, cruelty often wore the face of reason. to tie someone's wrists, to shut them away from the cold, to limit food when stores ran low. These were seen as practical measures, not punishments. Pity required resources most people did not possess. The presence of the mad within the household carried a strange dual meaning. On one hand, they embodied disorder, the visible consequence of divine mystery. On the other, they reminded their families of endurance, the grim virtue of bearing what could not be changed. To keep such a person alive, even in misery, was an act of faith. Villagers who visited might shake their heads but rarely interfered. They believed each family's burden had been assigned by God. To take it away would disturb the balance of justice and mercy that held their fragile world together. Over the years, these private confinements became woven into the fabric of rural life. Every village seemed to have a house that whispered after dark, a place children avoided and adults ignored. The afflicted themselves aged quietly, their bodies wearing down faster than their minds. Some outlived those who had once cared for them, left to wander the ruins of their own homes. Others disappeared into the forest or river, their deaths accepted as inevitable. No priest wrote their names, no physician recorded their symptoms. Their erasure was their cure. And yet, within this silence, a kind of coexistence emerged. Neither compassion nor cruelty, but something in between. Families learned to live beside madness, to accommodate it without expectation of change. The afflicted, in turn, adapted to their confinement, shaping rituals of their own. They stacked stones, murmured prayers, or arranged bits of straw into patterns no one else understood. Their isolation bred strange forms of peace, and though their minds remained broken to the world, they found rhythms that resembled calm. In the stillness between screams, they survived. The moral weight of their existence fell heavily on those who tended them. Parents grew old under the strain, their faith tested by repetition. They prayed not for miracles, but for endurance, for the strength to keep living through the endless sameness of days. When death finally came to the afflicted, it brought relief edged with guilt. Burials were quiet, sometimes secret, marked only by the turning of the soil and the whisper of a psalm. Life went on immediately afterward. The silence of the house, though strange at first, soon felt like grace. Such domestic confinement was mirrored in small parishes across Europe. Priests were aware of the hidden mad, but rarely intervened. To do so would have required resources and certainty that neither church nor state possessed. Instead, they advised patience and prayer. Madness, they said, was a cross to bear, a test of virtue for both the sufferer and the family. When the afflicted became violent, the priest might bless the house or sprinkle holy water, but the door remained locked afterward. The responsibility returned to those who had asked for help. The church's power ended at the threshold of the home. In towns, a similar quiet prevailed behind closed shutters. The poor were crammed into tenements. The mad among them disappeared into upper rooms where neighbours pretended not to hear. Among the wealthy, concealment took more deliberate forms. Servants were dismissed, windows shuttered, reputations guarded. A noble family might keep a disordered son secluded in a wing of the estate, tended by a single nurse who spoke little. Money provided comfort, but not understanding. Madness, whether dressed in rags or silk, remained equally unspeakable. What united these hidden lives was their invisibility. They sustained the illusion that society had contained disorder, that the afflicted no longer walked among the sane. By removing them from sight, the world could believe itself healed. The monastery's cell and the village attic served the same function. They transformed fear into silence, and silence mistaken for peace allowed progress to move forward without reflection. The pain that could not be cured was absorbed into the walls of homes, barns, and institutions, where it hardened into habit. Still, not all who lived in proximity to madness remained untouched. Some began to see in their afflicted kin not punishment, but suffering, an agony that required no moral justification. A few priests and physicians, moved by compassion or curiosity, started to question the old assumptions. They observed that illness of the mind could arise from sorrow, exhaustion, or loss as easily as from sin. Such ideas were faint and fragile, easily dismissed by those who clung to tradition. But they marked the beginning of a subtle shift, a stirring of empathy within centuries of fear. The medieval world, which had for centuries defined madness through theology and punishment, started, slowly and uncertainly, to look again at the afflicted with a different kind of curiosity. The great catastrophes of the 14th century, the plague, famine, and war, had shaken faith's authority, leaving cracks through which new forms of thought began to grow. In monasteries, universities, and the private studies of physicians, small but revolutionary questions were whispered. Could the mind's suffering arise not from sin, but from nature? Could reason, even when broken, still belong to the human body rather than the supernatural? These were fragile ideas, unfit for sermons but impossible to unthink once spoken. Writers of the late Middle Ages began to rediscover the medical and philosophical works of antiquity. Through Arabic translations and commentaries, Galen's humoral theory returned to Europe, now filtered through the observations of scholars like Avicenna and Averroes. They proposed that emotions and temperament were shaped by the body's physical state, rather than the soul's moral condition. Melancholy and mania, once seen as punishments or possessions, began to appear in manuscripts as natural imbalances, conditions that might be soothed rather than exorcised. The vocabulary of illness expanded to include the mind, and though the explanations remained crude, they signalled the beginning of empathy through observation. The word melancholia took on new meaning. No longer merely a sign of divine despair, it became a recognisable temperament, cold, dry, and inward turning. Physicians described it with careful detail: sleeplessness, aversion to light, a heaviness of heart that drew the sufferer into solitude. The condition was still moralised, but not entirely condemned. The melancholic might be sad, eccentric, or withdrawn, yet also thoughtful, even gifted. Scholars saw in this temperament something familiar, for their own long hours of study mirrored its symptoms. The madness of the mind was beginning to look like an extension of the intellect, a price paid for contemplation rather than for sin. Mania, by contrast, described those whose minds burned too brightly. They were driven by heat rather than cold, their humours overboiled. The frenzied shouted, fought, and tore at their clothing. Physicians treated them with cooling baths, leeches, and herbs meant to balance fire with moisture. To calm the mind was to calm the body. These early medical classifications were not cures, but they offered a language that separated suffering from guilt. The afflicted were patients now, however imperfectly, rather than vessels of the demonic. Hospitals began to reflect this change, though unevenly. Institutions that had long housed the poor, the sick, and the mad together started to experiment with separation. Records from some cities describe new wards for the frenzied or distempered. These were crude by modern standards: dark rooms, straw bedding, iron locks, but the distinction itself was meaningful. To separate the mad from the criminal implied that their condition was not wholly moral. It was an acknowledgement, however faint, that madness required care, not punishment. Among the clergy, a quiet compassion began to emerge. Sermons and treatises from the 15th century reveal a shift in tone. Priests still preached that madness could arise from sin, but they also allowed for mercy and judgment. A soul afflicted by despair, they reasoned, might be suffering beyond its control. Confessors were instructed to weigh intention more carefully, to see delusion as confusion rather than rebellion. This was not yet understanding in the modern sense, but it was a crack in the armour of condemnation. Within that crack, the possibility of empathy began to grow. Humanist scholars carried this fragile progress forward. They looked to the ancient world for examples of reason coexisting with madness, citing figures like Aristotle, who had been described as both wise and strange. The humanist ideal valued the dignity of the individual, even in imperfection. To study madness became indirectly to study humanity itself. Writers described melancholia as the disease of scholars, an affliction of those who thought too deeply or felt too keenly. What had once marked someone as cursed now hinted at sensitivity, even genius. The idea that the mind could be both wounded and profound transformed madness from blasphemy into mystery. The change in language carried immense weight. Physicians wrote of distemper, delirium, and melancholia instead of possession. The afflicted became subjects of study rather than condemnation. Illustrations from medical texts show men reclining with thoughtful expressions, their heads bowed in contemplation. Melancholics, not demoniacs. Madness was still tragic, but it was also human. This shift in imagery reflected a larger shift in perception. The mad were being drawn back into the circle of humanity from which they had been exiled. Some clerics and physicians even collaborated, their disciplines no longer entirely opposed. The priest offered comfort to the soul, while the physician tended the body. Each recognized the limits of his domain. Prayer might ease sorrow, but so might rest, clean air, or companionship. In the writings of certain hospital administrators, there are traces of practical kindness, recommendations that patients be allowed gardens to walk in, that they be spoken to calmly rather than restrained immediately. These gestures were small, but they hinted at a new awareness, that healing might come through gentleness rather than coercion. Still, progress remained precarious. Old fears lingered beneath new vocabulary. Theories of natural imbalance coexisted uneasily with superstition. Physicians warned that demonic influence could still mimic melancholia and that only confession could rule it out. The Church tolerated medical explanations so long as they did not challenge theology's final authority. The result was a patchwork of belief and observation, compassion, and suspicion. A patient might be treated with herbs one week and exercised the next, depending on which authority prevailed. The two worlds, spiritual and physical, overlapped rather than replaced each other. Even among the most enlightened thinkers, the line between empathy and fear was thin. The mad inspired fascination, but also unease. To study their minds was to confront the instability of reason itself. If madness could arise from natural causes, then it was no longer confined to sinners or heretics. It could strike anyone. This realization, though humane, was also terrifying. The recognition of shared vulnerability softened judgment but deepened anxiety. The same insight that inspired compassion also reminded humanity of its own fragility. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the first glimmer of what might be called psychiatry had appeared, though the word itself would not exist for centuries. Madness was still poorly understood, but it was no longer entirely alien. Physicians described it as part of the continuum of human experience, rather than an intrusion from outside it. In their manuscripts, suffering became something to be observed, categorized, and perhaps one day healed. Their tone, cautious, speculative, and occasionally tender, reveals the birth of a new kind of seeing. Yet this light was faint, and it flickered against the vast darkness of tradition. Most of the afflicted still languished in cells or cottages, their lives unchanged by theory. The hospitals that claimed to treat them often served only to hide them more efficiently. Compassion existed mostly on paper, its reach limited to the literate and the powerful. The poor, the voiceless, and the violent remained as they had always been, chained, forgotten, or quietly endured. Understanding grew, but only in whispers, confined to margins of books, rather than the walls of asylums. The world was changing, its language softening, its explanations shifting from divine wrath to natural cause, but the fears beneath those changes endured. Madness still embodied the boundary between order and chaos, reason and ruin. Even as scholars began to describe it more gently, they could not stop looking at it with dread. In this uneasy balance of empathy and anxiety, medieval thought approached its end. The human mind had begun at last to recognize itself in the mirror of its own suffering, though the reflection was still clouded by centuries of fear. As the late medieval world gave way to the dawn of the modern age, its beliefs did not vanish. They merely changed their clothing. The candles dimmed, the monasteries emptied, and the language of the soul gave way to the language of the body. Yet beneath the surface, the same old logic remained. The conviction that madness must be understood, contained, or cleansed. Every new century promised progress, but progress carried with it the faint echo of chains and prayers. What had once been the work of the priest passed into the hands of the physician, and later into the gaze of the scientist. The words changed, but the silence surrounding the afflicted remained. Renaissance thinkers prided themselves on having escaped the darkness of superstition, yet their curiosity often disguised the same unease that had haunted the Middle Ages. Where the theologian once sought the devil, the scholar now sought anatomy and air. The body became a map, and the mind, for the first time, was placed within it, an organ to be studied rather than a mystery to be endured. Madness was dissected into categories, described in elegant Latin rather than scripture. But the impulse was still to classify, to restore order by giving a name to chaos. The afflicted, whether saint or sinner, remained a mirror for society's fears about itself. As Europe moved through Reformation and reason, confinement did not disappear, it expanded. The new hospitals of the 17th and 18th centuries promised humane treatment, but their corridors echoed with the same isolation that had once filled the cloisters. The chains grew lighter, the cells cleaner, but the logic was unchanged. Society must separate the sane from the unsound. The mad were not burned or exorcised anymore. They were studied, catalogued, and quietly forgotten behind institutional walls. Even the language of compassion was disciplinary. To treat meant to correct, to restore function, to return the lost to usefulness. What could not be restored was still hidden away. Medicine learned to measure where theology once intoned. Instruments replaced relics, theories replaced miracles. Yet the physician, like the priest before him, continued to stand as an interpreter between the afflicted and the rest of the world. His vocabulary drew not from scripture, but from science, though it served the same purpose, to make madness legible, to place it within the boundaries of knowledge. Diagnosis became a modern form of confession. Patients spoke their symptoms to authority, hoping to be absolved by understanding. What they received more often was a new name for their suffering, less cruel perhaps, but equally isolating. The Enlightenment promised reason as salvation, but reason, when made absolute, has its own kind of cruelty. In its pursuit of order, it sought to silence everything that could not be rationalized. The asylum, the laboratory, and the lecture hall all became theatres for this new faith. Madness was displayed, analysed, and pathologized, its strangeness still essential for confirming what was normal. The audience changed, but the performance continued. The The medieval exorcism and the modern examination shared a single gesture, the attempt to force coherence upon the incoherent. What disappeared in this transformation was the voice of the afflicted themselves. In medieval times they had spoken through visions, delirium or silence, voices the church interpreted as divine or diabolic. In modern times their speech was filtered through diagnosis, rewritten in clinical terms. The result was the same. Others spoke for them. The cell became a hospital ward. The confessor became the psychiatrist. The penance became treatment. The tone grew gentler, but the hierarchy remained unbroken. The mad were still subjects to be read, never authors of their own condition. Even compassion, when institutionalized, carried echoes of control. The movement to moral treatment in the 18th century urged patience, fresh air, and humane care. Yet it was built upon the belief that the patient's will must be reshaped into conformity with reason. Freedom was granted only to those who behaved rationally enough to deserve it. Those who resisted were confined for their own good, a justification as old as the monasteries. The walls that claimed to protect them from cruelty also protected the world from discomfort. Madness remained the secret no society wanted to see. The industrial age hardened this logic further. Progress, with its factories and schedules, demanded efficiency. Madness represented waste. Institutions multiplied to manage what could not be made productive. The old moral vocabulary, sin, vice, possession, was replaced by the language of disorder, but the outcome was familiar. Lives were measured by their usefulness, and those who could not conform were deemed defective. The asylum became a city's conscience, its walls absorbing the cost of civilization. Inside, patients laboured, sowed, farmed, and died. Outside, society congratulated itself on having cured chaos through management. The 19th and 20th centuries refined the instruments of classification. Psychology replaced theology as the grand interpreter of the unseen. The mind became an object of study rather than a vessel of mystery, but the act of studying still required distance. Every test, every experiment, every diagnosis carried within it a faint shadow of the medieval cell, the separation between the observer and the observed. The desire to understand was sincere, yet understanding often came at the expense of empathy. To name suffering scientifically was to remove its voice, to translate pain into data. The modern world, like the medieval one, sought to master what it feared, only now in the language of progress. Yet through this long history of control and interpretation, a few voices of compassion persisted. Writers, poets, and reformers began to describe madness not as crime or failure, but as a dimension of the human condition. They saw in the afflicted a mirror of society's contradictions, its hunger for order, its terror of vulnerability, its refusal to accept uncertainty. Their work reminded the world that the boundary between sanity and suffering was thin, that the same mind capable of reason was capable of despair. These insights echoed the first humanists of the late Middle Ages who had dared to see the afflicted as human before all else. The cycle of forgetting and rediscovery continued, each age repeating the same lesson under new names. Even now, the echoes remain. The institutions may have emptied, but the logic that built them endures in subtler forms. Where there were once chains, there are medications. Where there were once cells, there are diagnoses. Modern language promises understanding, yet often restores the same silence by other means. The person becomes the patient, the symptom becomes identity, and the ancient fear of disorder survives beneath the vocabulary of care. The world still seeks to categorize what it cannot bear to confront directly. the raw instability of the human mind. To look back across the centuries is to see continuity as much as change. The medieval world believed madness came from beyond. The modern world believes it comes from within. Both in their own way have tried to master it through knowledge. Yet knowledge, whether spiritual or scientific, has never fully quieted the unease. The need to contain what cannot be contained, to make madness make sense, remains a constant in the human story. It is the thread that binds exorcist to doctor, prayer to prescription, fear to curiosity. In this way, the story of medieval madness never truly ended. Its vocabulary evolved, its rituals softened, but its foundation, fear of the unknown within ourselves, remains untouched. The silence of the monastery cell has become the sterile quiet of the hospital ward. The prayers of the priest have become the notes of the clinician. The centuries between them are filled with the same uneasy questions. What is sanity, and who decides? Each generation answers differently, yet none with certainty. And so the medieval world lingers, not in relics or ruins, but in the way we still speak of the mind, the way we whisper around its mysteries. The lamps have grown brighter, the words more precise, but the shadows have not disappeared. Every attempt to illuminate them only reveals new darkness. Understanding grows but faintly. The world changes, yet the fears beneath it do not. The battlefield remains the same. An unseen struggle between order and chaos, faith and doubt, heaven and hell, lit only by the fragile glow of a lamp still flickering in the dark. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.